think we can start. Hello again, everyone. Now we will go on with our second and the last session of today. This session will be about neurolinguistics, which is a really interesting subfield of neuroscience, and I'm really looking forward to learn about it. We will be together with Alba Hoca. Welcome, Hocam. Once again, I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation and join our seminar. If you let me, I want to start by introducing you. Alba Tuninetti, I hope I pronounce right, is an assistant professor at Bilkent University, Department of Psychology. In the year 2009, she completed her bachelor's degree in cognitive science in University of Pennsylvania. Then she got her PhD in philosophy from University of Pittsburgh in 2015. As a postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Alba Hoca worked at March Institute for Brain, Behavior and Development. She is interested in second language learning, bilingualism, and speech perception, which are the main topics that we will learn from her today. Since January 2020, she works in Bilkent University and continues her brilliant studies. Now, the stage is yours, Hocam. You may begin your presentation whenever you want. Once again, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for having me and for the very kind invitation. I'm excited to share with you some the way I've kind of set this up is kind of more kind of general information in terms of kind of neurolinguistics and psycholinguistics, and then a little bit about my own work towards the end. So I'll go ahead and share. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see, Hocam.
Great, thank you. All right, so my talk is titled Language in the Brain, right? So the representation and effects of second language learning and bilingualism. There we go. Okay, so if I could kind of, ask all of you, right? Maybe just with their little show of hands button on the Zoom, right? How many of you speak another language other than your native language? I see tons of hands popping up, right? Obviously, I feel like most of you probably do, especially given the fact that you're, well, listening to me in English. Okay, so if you kind of lower your hands, how many of you would consider yourselves bilingual? Okay, some other hands coming up, but definitely fewer than last time. All right. Thank you. Okay. So this is something that I do to kind of highlight the fact that the ways in which we define bilingual and kind of the divisions between bilingualism and second language speaking can be quite blurry, can be quite fuzzy. And one of the things that we do kind of in our research is trying to kind of figure out what are the boundaries, if there are any, right? And how are those boundaries represented, shifting, changing, right, with exposure, kind of both cognitively and neurally. So, sorry. Okay. So just to kind of give a brief overview, as I'm sure most of you are aware, right, most of the world actually uses more than one language, right? And generally, right, bilingualism is defined as the ability to use two languages fluently, right? And of course, this is a very broad definition. It usually falls under the term of multilingualism, right? So the ability to use multiple languages. And basically the kind of things that I'll be going over will be kind of how is it that we organize, right, two languages in the brain. And I'll concentrate here on two languages, but a lot of this can apply as well to multiple languages, like 3, 4, trilinguals, quadrilinguals, and onwards. The two kind of main things that are talked about when we talk about the organization of language in the brain, right, is whether things are organized separately, right, or together. And as is the case in a lot of scientific research, as we go through, right, you'll see that kind of there's a lot of evidence for and against both of these ideas. So just to give a little bit of history first, right, so multilingualism is basically something that happens, right, when you have two or more languages being used in the same or neighboring regions, right? So what we term language contact in linguistics. This can lead to language maintenance, right? Where one language continues to be used in a setting where it has more powerful neighbors, right? So something like French in Canada. French is not the kind of majority language in Canada, right? But it has an official status in Canada as an official language of the country. And so it has been maintained throughout the history of Canada. Language shift is when speakers assimilate to more dominant language, but the other language is present and is influenced by that dominant language. So this can happen a lot in what we term pidgins or creoles. So for example, in Haiti, where you're kind of assimilating to the dominant language that has been brought to the country, right? In a lot of cases, this occurs because of colonialism. But the other language, right, that was being used before is still present, and it kind of undergoes changes in things like its grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation based on that influence from the other language. And finally, language death, and this is kind of the elimination of a language. So for example, Gaelic Irish in Ireland for a long time was considered to be a very good example of language death in the sense that there were no more kind of native speakers of it. Some of these languages now and some of the work that's being done in kind of linguistics and kind of field linguistics is that they're undergoing revitalization to a certain extent. So they're kind of being, or it's thought that people are trying to kind of teach them and use them all again. So what ends up happening, right, is that language maintenance usually results in multilingualism. Okay, so as I mentioned before, right, the majority of the world speaks more than one language, right, but not necessarily at the same level of proficiency for each one. And so this varies a lot by country. Okay, so for example, in the United States, where I was raised, you only have about 20% of the population that speaks another language. Actually, I didn't check actually the newest census, that might have gone up a little bit, but it is still a minority of people. However, in India, in China, in the Netherlands, almost 100% of the population speaks more than one language. And I want to make clear kind of here is one of the things I really want to make clear is that this isn't just about kind of language as an abstract concept that, you know, kind of exists in this realm that is separate from, you know, the kind of daily lives that we have in the world around us, right? Government and public policies really influence this on a social and cultural level as well, right? So for the example, in the United States, there's a lot of basically a big push, right, to making sure that immigrants assimilate to the surrounding culture and languages, right? I moved to the United States when I was quite young from South America, and I had to take ESL, English as Second Language classes, right? And it's quite pushed. And it's very much as well the case that usually parents, right, family members are told to not use, right, their native tongue with their children, right, to try and assimilate them to whatever the dominant language is. However, in the Netherlands and Sweden and Norway, right, a lot of European countries, you begin schooling in a second language quite early, right, in elementary school, and they actually require certain levels of proficiency before moving on to the next level in schooling. So actually, it can be quite difficult to find in the Netherlands, right, you know, participants who are just Dutch speakers with no knowledge of another language, be it English or German or French, whatever it might be. In multilingualism in Turkey, right, so this is, again, kind of old data that I was able to find. So this might be a little bit different now, but from around 2005, right, around 13% of the population in Turkey speaks another language. But this is quite old because of the last thing that I could find, at least, on second language competence comes from the 1965 census, which is, of course, like I mentioned, quite old. Kurdish and Arabic seem to be the most popular languages after Turkish as a native language, not as a second language. And of course, like I mentioned, right, the historical, political, and kind of social pressures all influence the preponderance of bilingualism and multilingualism in these countries. So how do we define what makes a bilingual or a multilingual, right? Most people will say you have knowledge of two or more languages, right? And what's interesting, right, is when we start kind of delving into that a little bit, right, what we want to see, right, is that we have a decent, right, knowledge of speaking, reading, writing, and understanding in those languages. They're in kind of our field, simultaneous bilingual who's learned 2 languages from birth. Generally, right, this is the case of one parent speaks each language, or a sequential bilingual, where you learn 2 languages sequentially, one after the other, right? Usually you're speaking one language at home and one in like the community, at school, at work. However, these are, again, quite broad definitions, because if you ask, right, if you look for kind of the definitions that other researchers have had, you can come up with, this is from Li Wei, who's a very well-known researcher in the field. I mean, dozens of ways of defining what makes somebody a bilingual, right, and what type of bilingual they are. So, you know, where do we begin, right, in kind of figuring out how this happens, right, or how it is that we can even start to think about these things? So one of the ways in which people kind of really started thinking about how it is that we can think of speaking 2 languages as having effects, right, on our cognition, right, and how it is that we can define these terms that we use, right, is whether, right, there are kind of advantages and disadvantages to something like bilingualism. So we know, right, mostly from personal experience, right, that we can acquire more than one language, right? Of course, to varying degrees of proficiency. And of course, these are all affected by things like our first language, right? The motivation we have to learn that second language, our attention to learning that, things like working memory and executive control. So those are more on the cognitive side of things. But in turn, right, being bilingual, you know, affects those properties as well. So a lot of recent research has focused on how bilingualism or multilingualism affects cognitive and neural organization. So what effects do we get from needing to juggle 2 languages rather than one? When somebody speaks or uses more than 2 languages, right, that means that they necessarily have 2 mental lexicons, right? A mental lexicon being kind of the words that you're using when you are, well, using one language, right? There is the word for cat, right? We know what a cat is. And in Spanish, right, the word is gato, and in English, the word is cat. And in Turkish, the word is kedi, right? So those are lexical items that correspond to different mental lexicons. As it happens, because there are these 2 mental lexicons that are different, bilingual children tend to score lower sometimes on vocabulary tests than monolingual children's in one language at a time. And this is just simply the case that because they have 2 sets of information that they have to draw from, right? They're just being given double the amount of information that they need to access, which, you know, can make them score lower on one set of the information compared to the other set of the information. But importantly, when you combine the scores from the first language and the second language, which I'll term here L1 and L2, right, they show sometimes they can show the same level of performance, right? So it's not the case that there's necessarily a disadvantage, right? That's why I have it in quotation marks. It's a matter of how they're measuring this kind of information. And importantly, this is done with quite young children. So usually by the time that a bilingual reaches kind of the age of puberty, a little around there or a little bit before, they'll be at the same level as their monolingual peers. Other things that have been shown in kind of bilinguals is that they tend to show slower responses to picture naming tasks. Again, this is a very simple task where you just basically get a picture of something and you're required to name it as quickly as possible. Again, you're kind of accessing 2 sets of information cognitively. So the time spent accessing is just necessarily going to be just a little bit slower than a monolingual equivalent. They also can show lower scores on verbal fluency, again, because of the same reason. More tip of the tongue moments. The tip of the tongue moments are these moments we have where you can't think of the word that you want to say. It's kind of on the tip of your tongue. Then monolinguals, okay? And again, because you have multiple sets of information that you need to access cognitively. And so, right, it's taken to demonstrate that having the second language, right, can impede very fast access to the mental lexicon, right, to these perceptual representations that we have of kind of the words that we use in each language. So one of the things I like to bring up when I kind of get to talking about these disadvantages that have been seen in the literature, right, is that what does it really mean to say that something is a disadvantage per se, right? Has any kind of bilingual really found themselves hindered, right, in their daily lives because of the fact that they name, you know, a picture of a cat in Spanish or in English, in Turkish or in English, milliseconds later than their monolingual peers? Not necessarily, right? I mean, sure, you might be significantly 30 milliseconds slower than somebody who is monolingual. Can anybody perceive a 30 millisecond difference? You know, I'm not saying that it's not worth it to study these things, because I think it is interesting, right? And it does give us insight into the structure of our perceptual representations, into our cognitive representations. But I like to term it more as things like differences, because a disadvantage makes it sound negative, whereas something like, you know, sure, there are differences just simply based on how it is that we are kind of constructing the world around us and how it is that we're accessing information about the world around us. In terms of advantages, which we again might term differences, having two languages means that we're kind of juggling two sets of information at all times, right? And so bilinguals tend to show advantages in certain cognitive functions. And by advantages, I mean they're kind of faster or more accurate in certain things. Tasks that measure things like executive function, inhibitory control, conflict resolution, attention, working memory, but maybe only for things like nonverbal tasks. All of these have been shown that all of these tasks, right, our studies have shown that in these tasks, the joint activation of two languages kind of necessitates that bilinguals inhibit one of those languages, resolve conflict more quickly, and pay more attention to changes in their environment that demand responses with these systems. Okay, again, the fact that you have at least two, obviously, if you're a multilingual with more than two languages, you have more than two. But if you have two sets of information, right, you are constantly needing to kind of balance between them in terms of access and representation. And that means, right, that you are kind of generating ways, strategies, cognitive strategies, which might show advantages in certain areas. One way that we know, right, that bilinguals have both languages active at all times is through very simple tasks. So this is a very kind of classic task. This is an eye tracking task where basically the pupils are tracked as participants are kind of moving through screens. This is what's called a visual world paradigm. And basically, they're just asked to simply look at certain things, items on a screen, right? So on the left-hand side, we have a piece of candy. On the right-hand side, we have a candle. And for English monolinguals, candy and candle start with the same sounds, canned. And so when you start to ask participants, where is the k and, they will look at both of these. If we do the same with Russian English bilinguals, which is what Marianne and Spivey did in 2003, what ends up happening is that they will look at these first two items on the screen, the balloons and the shark. This is a study that's done completely in English. There is no mention of Russian anywhere in the experiment. They do not know that they've been recruited because they were Russian speakers. But they still look at both of these because in English, right, the shark and the Russian word for balloons shares the same beginning. And so they're more likely to look between these two pictures, showing that they're activating Russian even in an English setting. Again, so Russian English bilinguals will look at balloon when in an English environment because the Russian word begins with it. So Russian, right, that other language is active enough that it influences these very low levels of processing. A 2007 article that was quite a big, quite a big deal in our field by Ellen Bialystok's group up in Canada, showed generally, but when measuring dementia symptoms of dementia, bilinguals, both men and women, tend to show an average of 4 years later for the onset of those symptoms. So if we look at this, right, the age at onset, this is again for certain symptoms of dementia, done with a mini mental state examination, which is quite well used in neuropsychiatric literature. You'll see, right, that the ages for bilingual men and women is around 77, right? Whereas for monolingual men and women, it's around 72, 73. And so again, the idea here, right, is that the constant use of more than one language necessitates a certain level of cognitive flexibility, of cognitive use that, means that you're kind of exercising your brain at all times, and that you're obviously you're kind of putting things on, things like the onset of dementia symptoms come on a little bit later because of that of things, right? So it's important to know, right, that when we talk about the brain kind of coordinating two language systems, there is no single part of the brain that does language, okay? The adaptive control model by Abudalabi and Green is kind of one of the biggest, probably most well-known and kind of well-researched models of language control processes, especially for bilingualism and second language speakers. And the idea here, right, is that these processes that we use neurally, right, such as speaking in one language versus another, adapt to the demands placed on them. So basically, kind of, if you have down here in the bottom left, right, kind of a multiple language interactional context, right, you're going to be getting a lot of kind of activation in terms of kind of the things like the prefrontal cortex, right, where you're going to be kind of getting all of that executive function from the prefrontal cortex, kind of going through, and where kind of, again, no single part of the brain does language, but kind of in the parietal lobes is where a lot of kind of language areas are seen more often than not. And so kind of the interactions between these processes and areas, right, reinforce the connections, right? And so kind of allowing for a different type of processing compared to people who don't have these interactions. Sorry, I should have. Those circles weren't supposed to come up yet. So language does tend to be left lateralized, right? But it doesn't actually preclude right hemisphere activity. So for example, in English Chinese bilinguals, it seems that both hemispheres are activated to accommodate kind of an increased processing that happens due to very different writing systems between English and Chinese, right? So for example, if we look at the results of this Nelson 2009 study, we can see that native English speakers, when they're viewing English words, right, have this left hemisphere activity. Okay, again, so this is based on radiological data. So the right-hand side is going to be on the left side of the screen, and the left-hand side is going to be on the right side of the screen. And when they're viewing Chinese characters, right, they're going to get hemispheric or bilateral activation. And native Chinese speakers actually do this for both languages, okay? And this might just be because, again, they're used to processing both languages at the same time. And so they've just neurally, right, the processes that they're using for Chinese, right, are going to kind of be shared across English as well. Most studies have shown that kind of monolinguals and bilinguals, so both early and late bilinguals, activate the same cortical regions for language processing. So things, if we look at, for example, brain scan data from something like an early bilingual versus a late bilingual, we'll see that they kind of share a lot of the same areas of processing, maybe to different extents or to different degrees, right? But those same areas are implicated in processing both of the languages. And generally, kind of more recently, it's understood kind of in more recent years, right, that it's not necessarily the case that there may be differences in where the languages are being used, but that bilinguals may have potentially a more kind of efficient use of need less activation to perform the same task. So this is a study from 2012 showing that basically bilinguals show less activation of the anterior cingulate cortex, right, when performing the same task as monolinguals. The same area is used, it's just that there's less activation for it, potentially suggesting a kind of a strategy of efficiency, right? Active, okay? The kind of neural signatures of processing, right, don't need to be used as much when performing the same task. So I'm going to get a little bit into EEG and ERP, which is what I use in my research to study kind of the neural mechanisms underlying second language learning, speech perception. So just a quick overview for those who may not be aware, basically in EEG and for getting event-related potentials, ERPs, we use kind of electrical signals off the scalp that correspond to cognitive events during tasks, okay? So basically, you have a participant, this is a very old kind of image of EEG, right? You have a participant who's doing something, looking at a screen, you repeat that stimulus a bunch of times, and then you do a lot of pre-processing to kind of get an average waveform, an average response to those stimuli. Okay. So when it comes to using things like EEG and ERP, one of the things that's really nice is that you can really see kind of the time course of how it is that certain types of stimuli, linguistic stimuli in this case, are processed. So one of the things, excuse me, that one of the responses that's been used quite a lot and that I've used in my research as well is something called the mismatch negativity. And basically the mismatch negativity, or as it's termed here, you'll see in this figure, the MMN, right, is basically a measure of kind of detection in the environment, right? So do you notice a change from something that has been, this is used a lot in linguistics, is in terms of figuring out if people can perceive very small differences in their phonetic systems. So basically, what this study did, right, was that it used, it had children, right? So children who are native speakers of, right, so native speakers of Finnish and native and second language speakers of Finnish. And what they were interested in looking at was basically, do these children perceive certain sounds in their environment that are native to Finnish versus non-native to Finnish, and manipulating that based on the similarity to the Finnish sound. So for the second language users, what we see, right, is that for sounds that are similar to their native language, the dark black line, right? You see this just kind of a very, you have a dark black line to the similar sounds. And I guess the lighter, the skinnier black line, the dissimilar sounds, right? For the second language speakers, what you'll see is that there's a difference in the peaks of this mismatch negativity between the two, suggesting that basically the way that they're perceiving the similar versus dissimilar sounds as second language speakers is very different to how native speakers perceive it. Because if you go over to the right-hand side, there's basically no difference between the ERP lines. So again, this is showing kind of, right, that at these very early low levels of perception, what we have, right, is differences in how it is that these participants are able to perceive differences in their speech. In speech that kind of is either native or non-native to their native language. Interestingly, so this also kind of, we can see these changes in the temporal responses, even in late second language learners. So this was a 2005 study done by my PhD advisor, Natasha Tokowitz. And basically what she did was she looked at native Spanish speakers and then native English speakers who were learning Spanish. And these were American undergraduates learning Spanish at university, so maybe like an intro to Spanish or something like that. But what they show, right, and what I'm showing you here in kind of the circles, is that basically there was the gray line versus the black line, right? The gray line versus the black line. The kind of morphology, the shape of them is a little bit different between the two. But the fact that there is a difference between the black and the gray lines in the native English speakers shows that they're processing, this was grammatical violations, shows that they're processing these grammatical violations in a similar way to the native Spanish speakers. Not in exactly the same way, right? Because again, the morphology is a little bit different, but they're showing a difference. And what was really interesting about this study was that their brain responses were like, oh yeah, like that's incorrect. Like that's the wrong gender for that item that you're looking at, right? Because Spanish has gendered items. But if they did a behavioral task afterwards, where they were asked to gender items to see what their kind of behavioral responses were, and they were at chance, they had no idea. They would come out saying like, I don't know, like what the gender of these items are, but their neural responses are showing that to a certain extent, there is something that's kind of working when they are learning the language, because they are showing these responses that are similar to the native Spanish speakers. Okay, so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about reading and writing as well, just because I think it is interesting. It's not my main area of study, but I think second language and bilingualism, because all of these things can also, of course, affect how it is that we see neural responses in the brain. So, for example, learning to write characters in Chinese leads to better learning than writing pinyin. So for those of you who may not be aware, there's two different ways of writing Mandarin Chinese. You can write pinyin, which is kind of Latinized letters that have marks or kind of numbers for the tones that are used in Mandarin Chinese, versus the full like logographic characters that you might be more used to seeing. English speakers, right, are asked to learn to write, we're asked to basically learn Mandarin Chinese in an experimental task. Characters, right, the hard things in Chinese led to better learning than writing just the pinyin, okay? And this is thought to be because you're kind of activating multiple areas as you are learning something like character writing compared to pinyin writing. because pinyin writing basically draws on the same fountains of knowledge, right? The same kind of perceptual representations that we have for something like English, right? Again, it's Latinized letters, right? With Latinized numbers. It doesn't necessarily recruit the same neural areas as something like character writing, which is going to activate more different types of motor areas that may help, right? And then even though it's harder, right? Everybody in the experiment said it was harder to do the character writing compared to the pinyin writing, but they learned it better by the end because it was something that you're kind of, again, exercising your brain in a bit to kind of recruit different areas to put it all together. Of course, one of the things that's kind of talked about a lot, right, is that how is it that the types of languages we know affect how we kind of organize our neural representations. So things like logographic versus alphabetic languages, right? So again, say Chinese or Japanese versus Turkish or English, right? How the phonetics of one language influences the processing of another language. That's something that I'm particularly interested in. Grammar and morphosyntax, right? Showing kind of the different similarities and differences across languages in terms of their neural processing. And like I mentioned from the Tokowitz study, there can be what we call a dissociation between the neural responses, right, compared to the behavioral responses of participants. And of course, this links to kind of these very classic questions in kind of cognitive neuroscience, right? Of like, how is it that the brain gives rise to behavior, right? And why are these kind of implicit involuntary responses, right, different from explicit or voluntary ones? One of the things that's kind of most accepted in our field, right, is that basically when you're learning a second language, you are going to mediate through already established first language systems. So when you start learning another language, we are going to use what already exists perceptually, cognitively, neurally to learn that second language. So this means, right, that on the one hand, right, our first language is going to be like provide what we call competition for a second language, right? In the sense that like things that are different are kind of going to, clash against each other in these processing systems. But it can also help, right? There are things that can transfer and what's called positive transfer between the two systems, things like cognates, some sort of pronunciation, syntax, grammar, vocabulary. So for example, right, between English and Spanish, right, there are what we call cognates, right? So words that share etymological origins across languages. Usually they're easier to learn, right? Because the spelling and orthography tends to be similar. Okay. So things like, manner and manera in Spanish are cognates. Okay. It can also be affected by the characteristics of the words, right? So for example, the word frequency. So how frequent a word is in a language, how often it's used, basically. And the orthographic transparency. So this is what we term how transparent words are. Spanish and Italian tend to be very transparent languages. Turkish is as well actually quite a transparent language. Every letter you see written, you pronounce, basically. There's some production of it. Some other vowels, but in any case, Turkish can be quite transparent. English, on the other hand, is very opaque because there are many basically mappings that don't correspond one-to-one, right? So for example, the same letters that are written, O-U-G-H, in all three of these words, through, plow, and enough, are all pronounced completely differently, right? And the I, right, the same letter written in these three words, ill, like, and nation, again, pronounced completely differently. So English is very, very non-transparent, what we call opaque. And of course, these things can make it easier or more difficult, depending on the language, to pick it up. Of course, it's also affected by phonology, so how the word is pronounced, right, and similarities to other languages. Cognates are easy, right, because they tend to show orthography and sometimes phonology, right? But we have to be aware of things like false friends, right? So if being embarrassed, right, is not a cognate with being embarazada in Spanish, because embarazada means pregnant. And so if you say, estoy embarazada, to try to say, I am embarrassed in Spanish, what you're actually saying is that you're pregnant. And so being aware of those things like what we call false friends is also important. So we have things like competition, but similarity also helps, right? So again, these cognates and things like word order as well. So coming from what we call a subject verb object language and learning a subject verb object language will be easier. Negative transfer can be things like, for example, production. So certain sounds that don't exist in English and we don't have phonetic categories for will be very difficult to learn. In terms of morphosyntax, right? Learning when to put finite verbs at the ends of sentences can be difficult, right? As well as adding on suffixes. So I have this example of German here on the screen, but this happens in Turkish as well, where you can add suffixes onto kind of words. And for example, for me, coming from language backgrounds that have no suffixes or cases, it's been interesting to learn what everything kind of means as I work through a word. So for example, this very long word in German means a football team that makes it to the World Cup, because they've just kind of added on all of the things that make it mean that. So one of the things that I'm interested in as well kind of is this idea of inducing language learning, right? So how is it that we can go from not having a kind of a language representation to having one? A lot of this is done through what's called training studies, basically, so that you have participants come into the lab and you train them on certain things: grammar, morphosyntax, perception, whatever it might be. In perception in particular, right, the idea, one of the kind of big ideas is to kind of examine whether bilinguals and multilinguals, bilinguals or monolinguals, are more flexible in what they accept, right, as deviations from their first language, right? And this is because the idea, right, is that juggling two systems allows listeners to accept deviations or changes more easily. So, can we train perception to change? So, basically, the fact that there kind of these potential differences between monolinguals and bilinguals doesn't mean, right, that their frameworks are shaped or organized similarly, right? So are there differences, right, in how these monolinguals and bilinguals learn to accept new input? So training studies, right, can investigate how flexibly, right, the perceptual space can be reformed with this type of input. So I'm going to go over kind of an older study of mine that looked into this, right? That was a training study, particularly interested in speech perception. And in here, what I was doing, I was comparing monolinguals, so only language English, to bilinguals, English and Spanish. Okay, their first language was Spanish, their second language was English. And what I was interested in was basically, do the first language phonemes, right, the sounds of that first language, English, Spanish, influence the acquisition of non-native categories? Okay. And what I did was I trained over 5 days English and Spanish speakers on Hindi. Okay. And this is a contrast that exists in Hindi. Basically, the phoneme B, P, and what we call in linguistics an aspirated P, basically a P with a puff of air that comes after it, a P, compared to a P that doesn't have that puff of air. It's very hard to pronounce as a native English speaker. But basically, the idea here is that all three of these phonemes can mean very different things, even if you put them in kind of the same context, right? So bal, hair, pal, take care of, and pal, knife blade. Again, I'm not a native Hindi speaker, so I'm not producing them very correctly, but you get the idea. And so there's these three phonemes, right, that exist in Hindi, okay? And what ends up happening is that native English speakers, right, have the B, right? We, as English speakers, right, we have a B sound. And then the P and this aspirated P aren't separate in English. Actually, in English, we do have both of them, but they occur, there's not two different ways of formally recognizing them, right? There's not two different ways of writing them, for example. They're basically both versions of one category, a bigger category called P. In Spanish, on the other hand, Spanish doesn't have aspiration, really. When we speak Spanish, right, we don't have these puffs of air that occur after certain of these consonants. And so they really only have the B, right, which I used kind of in my experiment as kind of the control, and a P sound. And basically the idea, right, was to see whether they would learn to perceive this. So what I did was I had them do in the training, right, what we call an AXB task, where basically they have to listen to sounds and choose which one is different. Okay, so I hope these play. Let's see.
Bok, bok, bok.
Okay, so they listen to something like that, and they have to say, out of those three sounds, which was the sound that was different from the other two. Okay, in this case, right, this last one,
Bok, bok,
right, is the aspirated P, this is the unaspirated P, and this is the
bok,
ba, the B sound. This one I think is the easiest to kind of perceive, right? These two can be a little bit harder, right? They were produced by a native Hindi speaker, so there was a little bit of variation as well. And so what we did was we did a pre-test EEG recording, right, with no training whatsoever, just to see what their perception was before any training happened. On the 2nd through 4th days, they had this training with this AXB task. They just did it kind of continuously over and over again with feedback. And then they had a post-test EEG. So I'm going to go over the results for the pre-test and the post-test to kind of show you the difference between the two. So the idea here, right, the hypothesis is whether basically for English speakers, they're going to learn to perceive that, okay, this big category of P sounds should be divided into two to mirror the one in Hindi. Or if it's going to be easier for the Spanish speakers to come up with a whole new category and realize that, oh yeah, there's these kind of weird aspirated, you know, breathy, puffy Ps that are different from the other ones. So when we look at the results for the native Hindi speakers, so this was again the control group, right? What we see basically is that for the aspirated P and the B, we're looking around 200 to 250-ish milliseconds. There's basically not really a big difference. It didn't come out to be significantly different between the groups, right? So basically the peak of activity here is very similar for both of the groups. And this is kind of what I was interested in. There's clearly kind of some differences back here, but I wasn't as interested in those in this study. For the native English speakers, on the other hand, right, when we're looking at day 1 versus day 5, what we see, right, is basically that for the pH, the aspirated P deviance, so the brown line here, right, compared to the brown line over here, right, and the orange line compared to the orange line for the B deviance, right, there's not really any difference in the B deviance, which is expected to a certain extent. There does seem to be a difference between the brown lines, but this actually didn't turn out to be significantly different. So basically, it looks as though from day 1 to day 5, it's getting less negative. But again, this wasn't actually significantly different. Whereas for the Spanish speakers, it's actually kind of the opposite, right? What ends up happening, right, is that this pH deviant here, the brown line, the one that we're interested in, does end up going more negative by day 5, okay? And in this case, right, more negative mismatch negativities index a greater sensitivity, a greater kind of like involuntary accuracy at detecting that there's a difference between the two sounds. So they show the significantly more negative mismatch negativity responses after the training for this aspirated P, which seems to show, right, that actually it was easier for the native Spanish speakers to come up with a whole new category than for the native English speakers to split up their existing category. So we can, right, kind of figure out ways of inducing perceptual change, right? If you kind of, for example, in our training, we just exposed them to instances of these categories enough times. So we can train participants to learn to perceive new phonemes, right? In the same way that we can also teach people, right, new words and syntax and grammar, right? So as I mentioned, right, as I'm learning Turkish and kind of slowly learning new words and word orders, right, one of the things that comes up all the time, right, is, well, how can we do this more efficiently, right? Can we focus on kind of learning words and grammars and you know, do implicit sound accent learning? These are all kind of future research ideas, right, that are kind of coming up, right? Like, is it the case that, for example, when we're teaching words, vocabulary, we can also be teaching pronunciation, phonetic representation of new things? The idea basically is that, yes, we can, but there's a lot of research going on into what's kind of the most efficient way to do that. Of course, with increasing proficiency, right, the links between the second language and the concepts become stronger, right? So then the mediation, right, we talked about this mediation through the L1, doesn't have to happen anymore through the first language, right? And so you can learn to mediate only through the second language. We've seen that there can be a dissociation, right, between implicit and explicit behavior, right? And it's thought that kind of as we increase proficiency, right, these proficiency levels kind of allow for more synchrony between these measures, right? Such that our conscious behavior then reflects kind of these automatic neural responses. Word characteristics themselves of, you know, we know that a lot of things influence second language learning, right? We also have things like personal traits, right? So individual differences, right? How fluent you are in your first language, your learning style, like attention, motivation, these things that I mentioned before. And as it turns out, right, these individual differences in second language acquisition, SLA, right, is a field that is, according to certain researchers, right, the next big question for bilingualism, multilingualism, and second language acquisition. And what we mean by that is that basically there have been actually studies that show that actually structural differences in the brain have been implicated in how well or how fast one can learn the phonetics of a second language. So this is a study done by Narli Golestani. She does work in Switzerland and has really, really interesting work basically showing that higher performance learners, so better learners, show less activity in speech-related areas, right? So again, this idea that there's potentially more efficiency, right, in certain neural areas. Whereas faster learners actually show a greater white volume matter in left hemispheric regions compared to slower learners, so, right? So this is an image from one of her papers showing that faster learners in red show significantly different structural differences in the left temporal region from slower learners, right? So that basically like literally where it is that those regions are kind of located and activated when this is happening. So this is something that's kind of ongoing, right? How is it that these individual differences matter in something like second language learning? It's very important to note that bilingualism is not a categorical variable, right? And it's basically not just you are or are not bilingual, right? There's a whole continuum that happens. Language is, of course, a dynamic system that necessarily involves other cognitive areas like memory, attention, and perception. And we know that humans are, notoriously variable at these individual levels. So how do we quantify these, right, to keep this research valid and reliable? Well, one of the things that's kind of being done more and more, right, is that you examine individual differences not only as defined through things like executive function components, but actually as individuals. Like, how am I, as one person, different from somebody else? It's difficult, right? Because a lot of science is based on averaging, right? Groups of humans together to get data that differs from other groups of humans. But more and more, right, the idea is like, okay, that is important and valid to do, but also how might individual measures give us more information about this? It's also really important to look into things like non-weird communities. So weird being this definition of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Okay. And so it's important to think about these because it's the case right now that a lot of the work that we have on language learning is done with a very limited set of languages, right? So a lot of sentence processing work is done like less than 1% of the world's languages. And I mean, there's so many differences between languages and how it is that we process and perceive them, that having more access to kind of these more diverse and global communities is really important, right? Because this allows us then to develop holistic and comprehensive kind of perceptual frameworks. As a very kind of quick example, because I'm just wrapping up now, I've been active in kind of testing kind of remote and community populations with EEG, right? Because you can test outside the lab environments, you don't have to have people come into your campus, right? So that means that you can recruit a more diverse population, right? And it's harder because it's noisier, right? But it can also be more ecologically valid. When we talk in language, naturally, right? We're not just speaking in a soundproof booth to our friends, right? We have traffic and there's noise and we have conversations with other people that are kind of all coming in. So it can be considered more ecologically valid to a certain extent as well. So this is kind of an EEG headset that I used. This was while I was in Australia. We traveled in collaboration with some linguists at Western Sydney University, where we traveled to a remote language community in the Eastern Highlands of Papua New Guinea. And I, with the help of, community members, ran, this is all, of course, posted with their permission. They've given permission for these photos to be used. Ran an EEG ERP study, again, in a very natural environment, right? This is obviously not a soundproof booth. This is made from their natural materials that they use in their community to build their houses. There are babies crying and chickens squawking and, people cooking food downstairs and stuff. It's definitely more noisy, more ecologically valid in that sense. And here we're trying to, again, we're doing a little bit of this was 2 tests on a word marker that they have in their language, as well as a speech perception task. And hopefully that study will be coming out later this year. So just some quick take-home messages, right? So bilingualism and second language learning, I use them kind of as a tool to examine the perception, right? And our internal and external relationships to the world, right? How it is that we identify, right? And kind of interact with things in our environment. It's always important to remember individual variation, right? And especially with speech and adaptation, because we all speak differently. As an example, this was a more recent study. It actually turns out that second language speakers, we tend to perceive our own accents and pronunciations as better than that of our friends. So generally, we think that the way that we produce our second languages is better than what our friends are doing on average, which I think is kind of funny. Extending this work, right, to underrepresented or understudied languages is crucial, right? And of course, understanding the cultural, social, and historical pressures behind it is really important as well. And as a final note, just, because I know you're kind of all in university and academia, right? It's important to understand the pressures of academia on publishing as well, right? Because there's a lot of research, right, that isn't published, right, because of this idea that we always have to publish things that are significant. And so we have what's called the file drawer problem, where null results aren't published, but all of this could really contribute to our knowledge of these areas as well. There's a study done by DeBrain, which showed that there's a lot of file drawer problem in the area of bilingualism and second language learning that could really help us understand a lot more about the area. So thank you very much for listening. I think I went a little bit over time. Sorry about that. But to all of my collaborators, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Hocam, we really thank you. It was a brilliant and very comprehensive presentation, and you already answered most of my questions. But I have still questions from the participants right now. I'm gonna share them
Sure.
if you have time. Okay. Can you see?
Yes. Well, I see a black screen that says has started
Black
screen sharing.
screen?
Oh, yeah.
But I closed it. How is it right now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, this is our first question. Some people can learn a language so quickly than normal people. Have these people any kind of structural or functional differences, and can we detect it?
Yeah, so, well, one of the ones that I went over kind of towards the end, Golestani's study has shown, right, that there can be potentially structural differences in, in how certain people like pick up or are able to pick up languages. I want to say that I think like, I don't think that we should kind of take it for something that like, I'm never going to be able to learn a second language because I don't have like this part of my brain placed at this exact position in, the whole brain. But yeah, I mean, I do think that there are different, like, again, this idea of individual variation is quite important, and that potentially, yeah, there are some kind of structural or functional differences that might contribute to that to a certain extent. But that doesn't mean we can't overcome those to then, of course, learn language.
Some people can be a little bit more advanced, I guess. Okay, this is another question. Can the results of Sokovics and McWhinney's study you showed indicate that language acquisition device theory has empirical evidence? And if yes, LAD is present in much later ages.
This is a good question. The Chomskyan ideal of how it is that we pick up language. So I don't know that the Tokowitz and McWhinney study necessarily speaks to the language acquisition device, kind of this idea that we have something that we're kind of born with that allows us to pick up language from birth. I think the Tokowitz and McWhinney study is really more about the fact that we can use kind of the information that exists in our first language already to kind of help us pick up things in our second language. And even when those things don't exist, right, we're still able to kind of make those connections and start kind of those neural connections to help us get to that point. I will say, like, I mean, the language acquisition, it's a theory, right? And it does have empirical evidence for it and against it, like a lot of theories do. And it's still something that's quite talked about. So I think depending on kind of the theoretical framework in which psycholinguists and neurolinguists have been taught, right? I guess there is empirical evidence for it. And I guess I'm not sure that the Tokowitz and McWhinney study in particular speaks to that. But I would say that I mean, all of this kind of work is still kind of heavily debated, which is, of course, why we, still do research on this.
Thank you. And the next question here, yes. No. It is said that a habit sticks better if one combines it with other already existing habits. Can language be pursued in the same way? Does our brain do it without us acknowledging or should actively enforce it?
Interesting. So instead of the habit sticks better if we include already existing habits, yeah, so to a certain extent, I mean, this idea of kind of doing things without actively acknowledging versus without acknowledging it versus actively enforcing it is really interesting. There are certain studies that show that kind of having explicit instruction in a language helps you pick up certain things better than if you're just kind of getting exposed to things and not really paying attention to them, right? Without kind of the acknowledgement that you're talking about. But in the end, right, I think what's been shown kind of more and more is that it's a combination of the two, right? Having that explicit instruction, right? So I, for example, have taken, the Turkish classes that are offered here at Bill Kent, right? Explicitly been told, right? These are the rules of Turkish, right? This is the pronunciation of Turkish. These are blah, blah, blah. But also being immersed, right? When I go outside and I hear people speaking Turkish and I go to the shop and I have to, look at things written in Turkish and figure things out, right? That kind of non-acknowledgement, that immersion that happens without that explicitness, both of those work in tandem, both of those work together to kind of really lead to kind of successful language learning, which, well, I don't know if I haven't reached yet successful language learning with Turkish, though I hope to. But both of those working together. And that's one of the reasons why people say that if you want to kind of get the best experience in terms of learning a language, you should travel to a country where they speak it, because that kind of implicit background input is also super important, as well as the explicit. And yeah, I would say that basically, like, if you want to learn a second language or another language, definitely, if you kind of stick it with like existing habits, I think that would probably help, because the motivation and attention paid to it really is quite a big factor in how it is that we learn language. So if you have something that, you are learning, say, German or French or whatever, and you do it always with one thing in terms of kind of keeping it a habit, that's definitely a good way to go.
Thank you. And what are the relations between seeing dream in certain language? Is there a limit where you have to reach before you can see a dream in a certain language? Should you achieve to set a fluency level?
This is a very good question, and I will admit, not one that I really know the answer to. I have not yet begun dreaming in Turkish, that is for sure. I think there probably does have to be, I know for kind of personal anecdote that my husband, for example, who learned French when he started his graduate degree, because his graduate degree required French, I think he's gotten quite fluent now, and he's had some dreams in French because he's like mentioned them to me. So I think you probably have to achieve quite a high level of fluency, because I think the ways in which dreams, I mean, I don't know much about dreaming in particular, but what I do know is that they seem to be kind of consolidations of the things that have happened throughout the day or throughout the days before. And so probably having a good fluency, like a pretty high level of fluency, is necessary for dreaming in another language, because that would then kind of fit into the consolidation of those memories from the previous days, and how well the brain is able to kind of represent them and represent them, access them, and then consolidate them. If that's what dreams are really all about, which again, I'm, not entirely sure, but I think.
That's a good answer, I think. And this is our last question. Lastly, neurolinguistics is a relatively new field. Do you have any suggestions for the students interested in language acquisition? How should they pursue their career?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, look, I mean, I think, linguistics is quite an old field, and, kind of stemming from philosophy and psychology. But yeah, neurolinguistics can be considered, I think, a little bit newer. For those interested in language acquisition, I mean, I'd suggest kind of, reading. I think there's lots of books out there now written on neurolinguistics that I think are really kind of well done, and by good authors who are who kind of cover all of the basics really nicely. And then, kind of getting in touch with researchers, with kind of other students who are interested in that, and kind of, forming reading groups or things like that, talking to professors who are already doing that kind of work that you're interested in. And yeah, I think kind of, taking the initiative to kind of, look up books and videos and links and things like that, I think are probably the best ways to go. And not being afraid, I would say, to kind of contact people who do that kind of work. So for example, if you're interested in something like an internship or something like that at a lab, reach out to us, right? We know that students are interested in different topics and in different fields. And if you're interested in, working with a neurolinguist and they have room in their lab and they're willing to take you on, then, it's not necessary to have gone through an entire book by yourself already. And we all know that like not every course is offered at every university. So if you've never taken that course before, then it's not a huge problem. So yeah, that's kind of what I would suggest, reading the things that are out there and getting in contact with people who do it to kind of get a foothold in the field.
Thank you, Jim. It was a brilliant presentation and you answered all of our questions. Before finishing, we want to take a photo together if you want to also. So
Yeah,
for
sure,
those who
happy
are
to.
available, can you open your cameras if you want?
Do you do it from your side?
Yeah, I'm gonna take
Okay.
it. So I'm gonna just wait for 1 minute and then get. Okay, if you are ready, I'm taking it right now.
Okay.
1, 2, 3. Thanks a lot, Hocam, again. I hope we will see you in our next event again.
Thank you very much for having me, and enjoy the rest of the talks.
Thank you. So guys, thank you for your participation as well. This was our last session today. See you at tomorrow in our next sessions. Goodbye.